This is Chapter 4, Tissue, the Living Fabric. As we talk about tissues, we will define tissues as groups of cells that are similar in both structure and function. There are four main types of tissues that we will cover in these lectures. The first is epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissue is separated from other tissues in that there are 5 characteristics that you will see in epithelial tissue. The first is that they have special contacts. Here we see continuous sheets that are held together by tight junctions and desmosomes. These are things that we looked at in Chapter 3 when we introduced the cells, and we talked about the importance of the membrane proteins in the cells. So tight junctions, think of as that cell Velcro, and desmosomes are those strong connections between cells. In addition, epithelial tissues have polarity. When we look at epithelial tissues, we will see that there are apical, or top, and basal, or basement, surfaces, and that these will be slightly different in the way the cells are organized and shaped. The epithelial tissues are also all they're all supported by connective tissue. We will see that this might be reticular or basal laminae. This connective tissue support is important because epithelial tissues are avascular. Right? Avascular means epithelial tissues have no blood vessels. These are, though, however, innervated, which means they do have nerve fibers. So we have this avascular but innervated, so there's no blood vessels, hence the need to sit on connective tissue. And then we'll see there are some nerve fibers. Finally, epithelial tissues are going to be regenerative in that the cells that are lost will be rapidly replaced by cell division, and cell division would be that cell mitosis. In terms of classifying epithelia, we will first classify them based upon their layering. So we can have simple epithelium, which would be a single layer. Here you can see the basal and apical surface exists within a single cell. Here you have this simple layer sitting on connective tissue. The apical surface then is the top surface. Notice the difference in the cell. In stratified epithelium, we have more than 2 layers of cells. We still do have differences between our apical and our basal surfaces. The basal surface here is sitting on connective tissue, and we see as we move up, these cells may change shape a bit. That would be a classic stratified example. The other way to classify epithelial tissues is based upon the cell shape that makes up the tissue. Now, all epithelial cells are hexagonal, so they have a 6-sided shape. When we look at them in cross-section, we will see they vary in height. So the squamous are kind of squashed looking or squat cells. The cuboidal or cube-shaped, if we look at them in profile, where they are about as tall as they are wide. Okay. And then finally, the columnar are much taller than they are wide. We also may see a difference in the shape of the nucleus, where in the squamous we have these disc-shaped nuclei. Cuboidal nuclei are nearly round, and columnar nuclei are often elongate or oval-shaped. Let's look at some specific examples. In our simple squamous epithelium, we have a single layer of flat cells with these disc-shaped nuclei. Here we have this layer. This provides a good function in terms of diffusion and filtration. Okay. We will also see that these can provide a slick friction-reducing lining. So if we think about the inside of our blood vessels, the inside of our blood vessels is lined with something called endothelium. That is the innermost layer where we have a layer of these flattened cells. They provide a nice frictionless surface. Okay, so we would see these within blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, serosae, lining of the heart. In this, we are going to see this is air sacs within lung tissue. Here we have cell, 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 all of these cells forming this single layer. This allows for diffusion, so when air is breathed into these air sacs, it can diffuse into those cells easily. Now, simple cuboidal, here we have our cube-shaped cells. We still do have a single layer. These are going to be important in secretion absorption, and we would see these in places like the kidney tubules and ducts. Here you can see a nice example of a cube-shaped cell, and they're not all perfect cubes, but we have a nice round nuclei, and we have these nearly cube-shaped cells. All throughout here, in between where we see the epithelium tissue, we do see connective tissue. When we look at photomicrographs, when we look at these things under the microscope, we are not looking at the tissues all by themselves. We are usually looking at sections of organs. So you have to understand that sometimes there will be additional tissues. You have to look for what you should be looking for. So right here, this is going to be our example of our simple cuboidal. Now, simple columnar, we have a single layer of these tall cells. These nuclei may be more elongate. Here they still look pretty round, however they can be a bit more elongate. We can have ciliated or non-ciliated versions. So ciliated would lack cilia. Ciliated would have cilia, and that cilia would serve to move things along the surface. Now the next type of cell we're going to see doesn't nicely fit into the categories of stratified or simple. It's kind of in between the two, and this is called pseudo-stratified columnar, pseudo meaning falsely. Here we do have a single layer. The cells are a single layer. They all touch the basal layer, but not all of the cells reach the apical layer. So even though it looks as if we have multiple layers, this is really all one layer, but the cells are reach different heights. Okay. This is going to be important in creating mucus. Here we are going to see something called a goblet cell. Okay. The goblet cell will be embedded within the pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar. Goblet cells produce mucin, and mucin is the precursor to mucus. This area here shows you the cilia. The cilia create what's called a brush border. You can imagine this would be the lining of the human trachea. Within the human trachea, which is part of the respiratory system, we have these cilia that move, that help to move the mucus, and that is the mucus that helps to line and protect our respiratory system. Now the layered types of cells, here we see stratified squamous. Now in the stratified squamous, the basal layer cells actually don't look very squamous, but as we move up and up and up in the layers, we clearly can see that squamous cell shape. This, having many layers here, is going to form a protective layer. We will see this in Chapter 5 when we look at the skin. This would be the epidermis. Here we are seeing the lining of the esophagus. Okay, so here is stratified squamous epithelium lining the esophagus, right? You can see these many layers of cells. Now in terms of stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, the stratified cuboidal is fairly rare in the body. We will see this in some sweat glands, so when we look at the skin in Chapter 5, we will see some stratified cuboidal, and this is typically only 2 cell layers thick. The stratified columnar also is very limited. You may see this at a transition between 2 other types of epithelium. Right? So we will not be looking at this too much in depth. Put a pin in and remember the stratified cuboidal because it will become important when we look at sweat glands. Now there is an additional type of epithelial tissue that's called transitional tissue. Now this transitional epithelium, here we have several layers. The basal cells are cuboidal, but as we move to the surface, the apical cells are actually much larger, and they get these dome-like structures. This is going to allow for stretching, so we tend to see this in places like the urinary bladder. This transitional epithelium can be stretched without losing those tight connections between the cells. So that would be our transitional epithelium. Now in terms of the function, we see epithelial tissue serving 2 main functions, one of which is a glandular function. Now to quickly define what a gland is one or more cells that makes and secretes or releases a product. Now we can classify glands in a few different ways. One has to do with the way glands will actually release or where they will release their product. The endocrine glands, which we will study later in Anatomy and Physiology 2 in the endocrine system. The endocrine glands would be things like your thyroid gland, your adrenal gland, the testes and the ovaries. And here the product, usually a hormone, is being released internally. And by internally we mean into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, release the product externally. And that means external from the circulatory system. These glands have ducts, and the product is released from those ducts. We're also going to notice that, especially with the exocrine glands, that we may have unicellular or multicellular glands. Please remember that with the endocrine glands, there will be no ducts involved. We will not be spending much time looking at those right now. We will instead focus on the exocrine glands. Examples of these would be the mucus glands that line our respiratory tract, the sweat glands in our skin, oil glands or sebaceous glands in our skin, and salivary glands within our mouth. Now there are some unicellular glands. We actually mentioned one of these before. This is the goblet cell that would be found within the pseudostratified ciliated columnar. This is a single cell that acts as an exocrine gland. Now this does not have a duct per se, but this does release its product externally. So this has all of the parts that we'd expect to see in a cell. So we have the nucleus, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, mitochondria. So DNA within the nucleus is going to be transcribed. That transcribed DNA specifically is coding for the genes to make mucin. That will then go to the rough ER, where that rough ER will produce the proteins, gets packaged at the Golgi, and released. Now this is all showing you secretory vesicles containing mucin. So this cell is basically a mucin-producing factory. This mucin then gets released from the rest of the epithelial tissue, and it creates the mucus that lines our respiratory tract. Now, in terms of multicellular exocrine glands, there are differences here depending upon the types of ducts and the types of secretory units we see. So in terms of what we can imagine, the epithelial tissue forms an outer layer, and the glandular portion is a folding in, an in-pocketing or an invagination of that tissue. So we can see that the surface epithelium is shown here as this lighter color. The slightly orange color would be the duct itself, and the red color is then the secretory epithelium. So this is where the product is being secreted. This would be considered the duct. This is the surface. So in a tubular secretory structure, we have these tube-shaped, these look almost like test tubes in shape, as opposed to alveolar, which look more like clusters of grapes. These are much more rounded. This would be a branched tubular. So there's a single duct, and all of these a single duct. Here we have a single secretory unit. Here we have branching in multiple secretory units. We can also have compound ducts, and in terms of the compound ducts, here the duct actually branches, and off of each duct then we have multiple areas where we have secretory units. So this would be a tubular, a compound tubular, this would be a compound alveolar, and this is a compound tubulo-alveolar, where some of these are tube-shaped and some are alveolar. In terms of where we might see these, this is an excellent example of mammary glands. Going back, the sebaceous glands that we will look at in depth in the Chapter 5 information, the sebaceous glands are an example of a branched alveolar structure. Now the way this secretion occurs, if the product that's being secreted can easily be packaged into vesicles, so say it's protein in nature, we will see something called merocrine. That merocrine secretion is where the products are packaged into vesicles. Those vesicles cross to the edge of the membrane, the apical surface. Those secretory vesicles then fuse and release their product. This is what we would see in sweat glands, the pancreas, and salivary glands. Now in the case of sebaceous glands are the oil glands within your skin. So they are producing basically a fat or a lipid. Here, that product cannot easily be packaged into vesicles because those vesicles are fat in and of themselves. So you can't package a lipid within a lipid. So instead what happens here, the cells actually fill up and get larger and larger and fill with that until the cell bursts. So in the holocrine secretion, the whole cell bursts. Right? That then releases the secretory product. The other important function of epithelial tissue is to form membranes. Now, membranes are continuous coverings of the body. We have the cutaneous membrane, or the skin. And in the cutaneous membrane, we will spend an entire chapter looking at this in chapter 5. This will be mostly stratified squamous epithelial tissue in this epithelial membrane. We also then internally have our mucous membranes, and the mucous membranes line body cavities that are open to the exterior. Right? So here, this would be the digestive and the respiratory tract. These are considered mucous membranes. These are also made of epithelial tissue. There's another kind of important membrane called a serous membrane. And the serous membrane lines all of the organs within the closed body cavity. So within the closed portion surrounding the heart and the lungs, you can see that we have the visceral and the parietal serous membranes. This was covered briefly in chapter 1. So we have, for example, surrounding the heart, we have a serous membrane. The visceral pericardium is epithelial tissue that sits directly on the heart. Then surrounding it, we have a bit of space full of serous fluid. Then the parietal pericardium is what sits in that pericardial space, right, lining the body cavity. We have the same thing within the abdominal pelvic cavity, what's called the peritoneum. And that peritoneum is much more complex, and the peritoneum basically wraps around all of the organs of digestion. We have the parietal along the body wall, and the visceral peritoneum wrapping around each of the organs. Now that we have concluded our discussion of epithelial tissue, let us move on to our next type of tissue, which is connective tissue. Connective tissue is going to be found throughout the body. It's the most abundant and widely distributed of the tissues, and it's the most complex in that we see the most variation in the type, the structure, and the function. There are 4 main groups of connective tissue. We have their connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Now, even if you are not familiar with what connective tissue proper or cartilage is, hopefully everyone is familiar with what is bone and what is blood. And these two things are extremely different from one another. So you may be questioning, how do we lump all of these things together into a single category? In terms of the function of connective tissue is really vast as well. It goes everything from binding and support, the actual building of the body, protecting the body, insulation, and moving things around the body. So we have quite a bit of difference in terms of the function of connective tissue. The reason we characterize connective tissues altogether is that the hallmarks of connective tissue is that the tissue is not just composed of cells. So in epithelial tissue, we defined the entirety of the tissue by the cells that we saw. Here in connective tissue, there's also a non-living extracellular matrix that consists of ground substance and fibers. And it's this extracellular matrix that's really going to define the different connective tissues, but it also is going to define what their function is, so how those connective tissues function. All connective tissues also originate from the same embryonic precursor tissue called mesenchyme. So we take a look at this mesenchyme. Mesenchyme occurs as one of the early tissues within an embryo. Then the cells within the mesenchyme may change, and they may follow one of these 4 pathways. Okay. Depending on how they change or differentiate, we may lead to seeing connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, or blood. And that's basically the path it will follow in terms of looking at these different types of connective tissues. Now, the structural elements of the connective tissue, what gives connective tissue its structure, is more than just the cells. So we have ground substance, and that ground substance is going to be material that fills a space between the cells. The cells in connective tissue are fairly well spaced out. Another important component is going to be the fibers. Now, the fibers, these are protein fibers. Collagen is one type. We can also have elastic or reticular fibers. Now the cells themselves, the cells are what produce the fibers, produce the ground substance. The main types are going to be fibroblasts. Those fibroblasts obviously produce fibers. Fibroblasts are going to be important in connective tissue proper. Chondroblasts, whenever you see chondro, think of cartilage. These chondroblasts are going to produce cartilage. We also have osteoblasts, where you see osteo, think of bone. These osteoblasts are the bone cells. And then we also have hematopoietic stem cells. These are going to create blood. If you see hema or hemato, you should be thinking blood. These are also alternately called hemocytoblasts. Hemocyto meaning blood cell, and blast, where we see this this word root of blast. That means a cell that can produce the tissue. Now we'll take a moment and focus a little bit more on the ground substance. This ground substance is going to include things like the interstitial fluid. This is the fluid between the spaces. And a mix of different proteoglycans and different proteins that's going to hold the entirety of this ground substance together. Ground substance is going to be really important in terms of being the connective tissue's strength, or the substance of it, right? The material that makes it up. Now the fibers, okay, we do have collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are tough fibers. They have high tensile strength. The elastic fibers are much thinner. Elastic fibers are stretchy. Okay, so if you think about collagen giving a tissue strength, elastic fibers would give it stretch. Now the reticular fibers are more for support. These are very delicate, and they are more diffuse. Now the most obvious examples of fibers we will see will be in a tissue called areolar connective tissue. Okay, not all of the connective tissues will actually have fibers, and we'll see which of these do not have fibers as we look at the different examples of connective tissue. Now the cells are important because the cells are what are going to create that ground substance. So we do have our fibroblasts, which will lead to our connective tissue proper, our chondroblasts, which will lead to cartilage, our osteoblasts, which lead to bone, the hematopoietic stem cells, which will lead to blood, right? And then within those hematopoietic stem cells, we'll also see that throughout this, we would find white blood cells, plasma cells, macrophages, and mast cells throughout. Now this last grouping here, even though these are blood cells or originate from blood cells, these are really involved more in our immune response, and we'll see that these cells are fairly diffuse throughout the body and are actually quite ubiquitous. We're going to start off looking at connective tissue proper, so we're going to be focusing on those types of tissues that are created by these fibroblasts. There are 5 main kinds of connective tissue proper under 2 loose categories. One is loose connective tissue, the other is dense connective tissue. We will look at examples of each of these. So loose connective tissue, the first kind is areolar connective tissue. Here we very clearly see those different fibers. So we have our collagen fibers, our elastic fibers. You can see the nuclei of the fibroblasts. Those are the cells that are going to be producing this. We will also see things like macrophages and white blood cells and mast cells. This is very widely distributed throughout the body, and we would find this wrapping and cushioning organs. In looking at this in terms of a diagram, this shows you all of the components. When you look at this under a microscope, you might not see all of the components in any one view, but here we see all of those components in kind of a drawing. Now, adipose tissue. Here we have these adipocytes. Right? Adipose tissue is going to be important in storing fat. Okay. This shows you cells are here, and this big white open space in here, that's actually where you have a vacuole containing a fat droplet. So all the rest of the cell has been kind of pushed towards the edges. You can see the nuclei here, and the entirety of that cell is basically full of this fat droplet. This is where we're going to have storage of extra energy in terms of fat being extra energy stored. This will serve also to protect our organs. It will act as insulation. It's found all throughout the body. We have subcutaneous adipose tissue, which is below the skin, within the abdomen, the breasts, throughout the body, we would have this adipose tissue. Now the third kind is reticular tissue. This reticular tissue, here you have within lymph nodes, bone marrow, the spleen, you have these delicate networks of this loose ground substance with very obvious reticular fibers. This forms a soft stroma that helps to support other cell types. So this is an example of reticular tissue. Now in all three of these, we saw that these had a loose organization. Please compare that to the dense regular connective tissue. Now this is our example of a dense connective tissue proper. Here we have collagen fibers. Those collagen fibers are organized in a very regular pattern. Those collagen fibers give a good deal of strength. This would have a large amount of tensile strength, so if we grabbed this end, and pulled, this tissue would be very strong. So we'd find it in things like tendons and ligaments, okay, which we'll see in chapter 8. Those are going to be what connect muscles to bone and bone to bone. Now compare this dense regular connective tissue to dense irregular connective tissue. Here, once again, we see collagen fibers. However, they're less regularly arranged. These would be moving in all dimensions. So you can imagine in any two directions, there's not as much tensile strength, but there is some degree of strength all around. So this would withstand tension in many directions. And this is what we would find in the dermis of the skin, the submucosa of the digestive tract. This is something that is strong, that can undergo stretching, that can undergo pushing and pulling. So for our, imagine this would be not lining the stomach, but as part of what's called the submucosa of the stomach. So when you eat a big meal and your stomach expands, this can expand as well, but it also resists some expansion, and it helps to provide that strength within your stomach and or your skin. Now the next types of connective tissue would be cartilage. When we take a look at cartilage, this is still considered a connective tissue, so let's bring ourselves back to this chart. We looked at the fibroblast lineage, okay, that is the loose and dense connective tissue. Now we're going to imagine this mesenchyme, these mesenchymal cells, become chondroblasts. Whenever you see chondro, think of cartilage. We're going to look at three main kinds of cartilage here. The first cartilage is hyaline cartilage, and this hyaline cartilage has an amorphous or a shapeless matrix. There are collagen fibers, but due to the way they're organized, they're not really obvious in terms of seeing them. Here we have our individual chondrocytes in these little spaces, and these little spaces are called lacunae. All of this amorphous area in between here, this would all be considered your matrix. This is fairly strong. It resists compression. This is going to be the type of cartilage you would find at the edge of your nose, within your trachea, within your larynx. We will see this capping the ends of your long bones, very important when we talk about joints in Chapter 8, and also within what's called the costal cartilages, so the cartilage that connects the bony portion of your rib to the bony portion of your sternum. And now elastic cartilage is similar to hyaline cartilage. Overall, there are more of these elastic fibers. You can see these networks of elastic fibers. This gives more flexibility to this cartilage. We still do see chondrocytes within lacunae. This is what you would see in the external portion of your upper ear. Right? You can imagine that you could fold your ear now and it would spring back up. That is not the case of what would happen to the tip of your nose. Now the last kind of cartilage is fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage is similar, but now we have very clear, very organized paths of those collagen fibers. Overall, this is less firm. This has a much higher tensile strength, and it can absorb shock. We still do see chondrocytes in lacunae. This is what we would find in the intervertebral discs, and also within the symphysis, what's called the pubic symphysis, and we'd see this within the menisci of the knee, all of which we will look at in depth in Chapter 8. So those are the three examples of cartilage. If we jump back here, we now see mesenchyme. The next pathway is the osteoblast pathway. Osteoblasts mature to become osteocyte. Okay, and there's actually two different kinds of bone. We're only going to mention compact bone for the moment. We will spend a good portion of time in Chapter 6 talking about bone. Okay. Bone, one of the most important things is that it's hard. The matrix of bone is hard and calcified. The lacunae would be these small dark areas here. The osteocytes would be within them. These larger dark areas here, if you can imagine these looking like concentric rings, this is what's called the central canal. Bone has in its organization, it is built to withstand pressure, to be hard, and to be strong. Bone obviously is important in terms of moving us. It acts as a lever on which muscles can actually move. But there are some other functions of bone as well, including storing things like calcium, minerals, and fat. And in some areas of bones where we're going to see hematopoiesis, which is the creation of new blood cells. Now we will look at this much more in depth in Chapter 6. But just as an overview, these would be the functional units of bone, and we have this hard calcified matrix. Now the last path that we want to look at is this fourth path here. These are the hematopoietic stem cells. This would lead to blood. Right? Now blood cell formation and differentiation is really, really complex. This will be covered separately in another chapter. We will simply look at blood in terms of the fact that blood is considered a connective tissue. However, it has a fluid matrix called plasma. Right? The cells within it, these would be red blood cells. Red blood cells are unique in that they lack a nucleus. Here we have different white blood cells. There are several different kinds of white blood cells. You will focus on those more in a later chapter. And what blood does, blood functions in transport. So what blood is a transport medium that helps to move things like oxygen and nutrients to actively metabolic cells, and helps to move wastes away from them so they can be released from the body. So that concludes our connective tissues. Now the next category of tissue, right, we're only going to look at one example, and that's called nerve tissue or nervous tissue. This is tissue that would make up your brain, spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves. Here we see these very distinct cells. These cells have a unique shape. This is the cell body. And they have these very clear projections coming off. These projections are processes. These are called axons and dendrites, depending on where we're seeing these. What these cells or neurons do, these individual neurons help to send signals. Now, surrounding all of this, we also will see what are called supporting cells or glial cells, and we will look at this in depth in Chapter 11. Now that leads us to our final type of tissue, and this is muscle tissue. We will look at three kinds of muscle tissue, the first of which is skeletal muscle tissue. Now in skeletal muscle tissue, we have muscle fibers that run in nice parallel bands. These fibers have a striped or a striation to them. You can see these little stripes. In Chapter 9, we will talk about what creates those stripes and where those come from. This is going to be important in our voluntary movement. These are all of the skeletal muscles that attach to the bones or the skin that we can consciously move. An interesting component of skeletal muscles is skeletal muscles cells are one of the few cells we'll talk about that are called multinucleate. So they actually have more than one nucleus, and that has that's pretty unique. So if you look at this diagram here, we have several nuclei. Now that's compared to cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is found only within the walls of the heart. It does have striations, so you do see striations like you would see in skeletal muscle, but you also have these very distinct branches. These branches are going to be one of the things that differentiates between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. The other thing are these darker regions called intercalated discs, and those intercalated discs are going to be where the different cells abut one another. Now, the last kind of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue, the cells are spindle-shaped, right, where they are thicker in the middle and they come to little points at the end. Notice there are no striations. These have a very different manner of contraction, which we will see again in Chapter 9. These usually occur in big sheets, and those sheets of smooth muscle are going to be found within our hollow organs. The smooth muscle is involved in contraction of involuntary muscle, so things like contraction of the stomach, contraction of the small intestine, contraction of the uterus. We would see mostly smooth muscle.